Refusing to join Karen's Lake HOA was treated like treason in her little empire. By sunrise, 2 men dressed in counterfeit uniforms were hammering on my cabin door, shouting accusations that I was trespassing on HOA-controlled land. All of these simply because I wouldn't submit to the lake rules Karen had drafted herself. Within the hour, she would unknowingly set off a chain of events that would unravel everything she thought she controlled. One forgotten boundary line, a single detail on an old map, would be enough to make her entire HOA operation collapse. It was early on a Monday morning when the pounding began, rattling the cabin like someone was trying to wake the dead. I stirred in the small log home I'd lived in for 3 peaceful years by the waters of Lake Serenity. Through the window, I spotted 2 men standing rigidly on my porch, their uniforms designed to project authority. One held a clipboard, the other hovered near what looked like a radio. They carried themselves with the air of official buzziness, just convincing enough to fool someone less suspicious. David Martinez, under Temporary Community Management Order 447B, you are in violation of community standards. Open the door so we can discuss your compliance status. The tone was a mix of bureaucratic coldness and barely veiled hostility, something I'd learned to recognize after 45 years on this planet. Still, something about them was wrong. Maybe it was how their badges caught the morning light, or maybe it was my natural skepticism, sharpened by years of work as a land surveyor. Moving carefully, I approached the door and studied the details. The badges said Lake County Sheriff, but the lettering was off, like a cheap imitation. More importantly, Lake County had no jurisdiction here. This land was under state police and municipal authority. And Temporary Community Management Order? That wasn't any legal language I'd ever encountered. After decades of reading codes and deeds, I knew the difference between legitimate terminology and made-up jargon. I'll need to verify your credentials and the legitimacy of that order before I open this door, I called back, reaching for my phone to alert real law enforcement. Their reaction told me everything. A quick exchange of glances, a subtle shake of the head, and suddenly they were backing toward their car. If they had been real officers, they would have expected to be questioned. Instead, they clearly wanted to avoid scrutiny. You haven't heard the last of this, Martinez, one of them barked as they climbed into their unmarked sedan. Community standards will be enforced one way or another. The threat was meant to intimidate, but it only confirmed my suspicions. I filmed them as they drove away, catching their license plate and every detail I could. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had met the woman behind all of these, the self-proclaimed temporary HOA coordinator who had decided to turn my quiet retirement into a legal battlefield. Her name was Karen Whitmore. She had shown up at my door one Tuesday with an aggressive kind of cheerfulness that immediately set me on edge. Clutching a fat stack of documents and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she introduced herself as the newly elected head of the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association. Her words sounded polished enough to sway most people, but my background told me otherwise. The way she leaned on phrases like demographics, while glancing deliberately at my last name, revealed her true intentions. Well, Mr. Martinez, she began, I've been chosen as the interim coordinator of our association. With so many recent changes in our community makeup, it's important we preserve standards that protect property values and neighborhood harmony. The implication was clear. My presence didn't fit her definition of standards. She shoved the paperwork into my hands: fees, restrictions on fishing, house paint colors, and penalties that looked more like a revenue scheme than genuine community rules. I'd worked with real HOAs before, and nothing about her documents resembled legitimate governance. I won't be joining any association I didn't choose to be part of, I told her, handing the papers back without reading further. The shift in her demeanor was immediate. The artificial friendliness vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look that suggested she wasn't used to being told number. You don't seem to understand, Mr. Martinez, she replied sharply. This isn't optional. Under state temporary community management provisions, all property owners must comply with interim standards during the organization's formation period. Her confidence might have fooled someone else, but I knew enough to recognize improvised legalese when I heard it. Real statutes don't sound like something cobbled together for a sales pitch. After she left, warning me that I'd regret my choice, I did what any sensible person would do. I started digging. What I uncovered was as troubling as it was predictable. Lake Serenity HOA didn't even officially exist yet. Karen's application was still pending because she hadn't secured enough homeowner signatures, and when I cross-referenced the properties she had targeted with her so-called compliance visits, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every single family she confronted had a Hispanic surname. Meanwhile, families with names like Johnson or Miller had been politely offered grace periods to think it over. That night, I opened the old chest that held my grandfather's surveying instruments and the family's land records, some dating back to 1887. Inside was the original deed that confirmed our ownership of this land for generations. A broken bar. This land wasn't just dirt and timber, it was legacy. My great-grandfather bought it outright with the money he earned building the railroad that first connected this region to the wider world. As I traced the boundaries on those hand-drawn maps, a slow grin crept across my face. Karen Whitmore was about to discover that sometimes the quiet man who only wants to be left alone is also the one who knows exactly how to strike back when provoked. Her stunt with the fake officers had taken this situation far beyond petty harassment. It was time to show her what happens when you try to threaten someone who understands both the law and the precise limits of his land. The moment those imposters drove off, I called the real sheriff's office. Sheriff Johnson himself picked up on the second ring. When I explained what had happened, his response was sharp and immediate. Impersonating law enforcement on your property, Mr. Martinez, that's a federal offense. Did you get them on camera? I described the counterfeit uniforms, the shaky badges, and their quick retreat when I asked for proof. I could hear the outrage rising in his voice. He promised to send a deputy within the hour to take my statement and launch an investigation into what he called a serious breach of public trust. While I waited, I started digging deeper into Karen's background. What I uncovered chilled me. Using access to old professional databases from my surveyor days, I found she'd operated under at least 2 other names in Arizona and Nevada. In Arizona, she was Sandra White, stirring up trouble in a Native American community near Casino Land. In Nevada, she went by Karen Walsh, targeting elderly Hispanic homeowners near a proposed golf course resort. The pattern was unmistakable: fabricated community management orders, false claims of authority, intimidation, and harassment of minority landowners until they either sold cheap or abandoned their property. Then, without fail, a shell company would swoop in to buy the land for pennies, flipping it later to big-money developers for massive profits. Each time, the shell companies had different names, but the financial trail pointed to the same parent, Pinnacle Development, a corporate giant with projects in over 20 states. This wasn't a one-woman scam, it was part of a much bigger machine. Deputy Mike Torres arrived just as I finished printing the evidence. He was second-generation Mexican-American like me, and the anger in his face was obvious when I showed him the records. Dios mío, David, a broken bar. This isn't just an HOA scam. She's been systematically targeting Latino families. Luca Martinez, Santos, Rodriguez, Herrera, every single one. Meanwhile, the white families got time to think it over. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. Then he admitted something that made my jaw tighten. 3 weeks ago, she came to me, said she wanted help with a community standards that talked about improving property values, cutting down on crime. I thought I was helping the neighborhood. Now I see she was using me. The shame in his voice was heavy, but so was the fury. She's dangerous because she manipulates good people into enabling her, I told him. That's how she builds power. I spread the county records across my kitchen table like a battle map. Here's where she made her biggest mistake, I said. She assumed my family must be recent immigrants with no documentation. She never checked the history of this land. The original survey maps from 1887 told a story she never bothered to learn. My great-grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had purchased the land legally with his own wages, and the deed had been on county record for over a century. And those maps revealed something else. Our family's claim extended well beyond my cabin. The legal boundaries reached all the way along the lake's shoreline, a broken bar including the exact spot where Karen had built her HOA office. Mike, look here, I said, pointing to the faded script on the deed. The eastern line runs to the high water mark, then follows the shoreline south for 2,000 feet. That shiny new HOA office she's so proud of, it's sitting on Martinez land. Mike went quiet, studying the documents against modern aerial photos on his tablet. If this survey holds up, he said slowly, Karen isn't just running a con, she's committing fraud, impersonating officials, and now she's built a permanent structure on property she doesn't own. That's criminal trespass, felony stuff. When he looked up, there was a flicker of awe in his eyes. Do you realize what this means, David? Every letter she's mailed, every threat, every dollar she's collected, it's all invalid. She's never had a shred of legal authority. The pieces of Karen's downfall were snapping into place like puzzle edges, but I also knew this was only the beginning. People like her didn't walk away quietly when challenged, they doubled down. Mike, I warned, when we push back, she'll escalate. She's too invested to let go. Are you ready for that? He nodded firmly, though I could see the unease in his eyes. Neither of us could have guessed how far Karen would go to defend her crooked empire. That evening, I sat on my porch, staring across the lake at her illegally built office as the sun dipped behind it. Tomorrow, I would file the first legal actions to dismantle everything she'd built. But for that one moment, I allowed myself to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had picked the wrong target. Karen Whitmore was about to learn that the quiet man with the old maps also knows how to bring down an empire built on lies. And sure enough, she struck back faster than I expected. The very next morning, I woke to find my driveway blocked by an unmarked van. 2 men in security uniforms stationed on my property in plain view. They weren't even trying to hide. This wasn't law enforcement, it was intimidation, pure and simple. When I stepped out onto the porch with my morning coffee, one of the so-called security guards barked out, "Mr. Martinez, for community safety, you're required to stay on your immediate property until compliance issues are resolved." The arrogance was astounding, but it also told me Karen was running out of options. She had escalated from phony paperwork to outright intimidation. I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, I calmly recorded everything on my phone: faces, uniforms, license plate. Tessa then called Sheriff Johnson directly. "Sheriff," I said, "Karen Whitmore has planted private security on my land without consent. They're claiming authority to restrict my movement." His response was swift. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars rolled up, and suddenly Karen's rent-a-cops were being grilled about permits, employers, and whether they had any legal authority to even be in the county. While the deputies dealt with them, I focused on the counterattack I'd been preparing. The night before, I had sat with my attorney, Sarah Chen, drafting a comprehensive legal strike that would hit Karen's operation from multiple angles. Sarah was an expert in housing discrimination cases, and when I showed her the evidence, she didn't hesitate. "David, this isn't just HOA fraud," she said. "This is a textbook case of housing discrimination. We can file under the Fair Housing Act. Once the feds get involved, it won't just take down Karina, it could expose the entire Pinnacle development network." At the heart of our case was a civil rights complaint documenting how Karen enforced standards differently depending on ethnicity. Hispanic families got threats and demands for immediate compliance, while white families were given extra time and friendly consultations. The most damning piece was a recorded phone call Mike Torres had saved, in which Karen openly talked about maintaining a demographic balance in the community. Sarah was certain that evidence alone would launch a federal investigation. But we weren't stopping there. Our most devastating weapon was the land survey, the certified proof that Karen's entire HOA headquarters sat on Martinez property. Sarah had brought in a licensed surveyor to confirm the original 1887 boundaries, and the findings were crystal clear. Karen's office was an illegal structure, and every action she carried out from it was built on a lie. "David," Sarah had said with a gleam in her eye, "she's built her empire on sand, and we're about to sweep it away." The showdown came that very afternoon. Karen herself marched onto my property, flanked by a handful of residents she'd duped into supporting her, a man she introduced as her attorney, and a woman with a professional camera filming everything for community records. It was a staged performance, a public spectacle designed to pressure me into folding. "Mr. Martinez," she declared loudly, making sure the camera caught every syllable, You are in violation of 17 separate community standards. As the duly appointed interim coordinator of Lake Serenity, I am here to inform you that your refusal to comply will result in enforcement actions, up to and including removal from community participation. It was almost laughable. Theatrical as it was, I could see some of the residents actually believed her. I waited until she finished her speech before replying in the steady, measured tone I'd mastered after years of dealing with obstinate bureaucrats. Miss Whitmore, I have a few questions for you. First, can you provide documentation showing that the Lake Serenity HOA has been formally registered with the state? Second, under what law do you claim authority over private property without the owner's consent? And finally, are you aware that your office building is sitting on Martinez's family land? Her mask cracked instantly. The commanding air drained away, replaced by a flicker of panic. Her so-called lawyer stepped in, scrambling to take control. Mr. Martinez, he said, the Temporary Community Management Authority is recognized under state provisions for emergency enforcement of standards. Your family's historic claims aren't relevant under current zoning laws. I couldn't help but smile as I pulled out the certified survey papers Sarah and I had prepared. On the contrary, I said, these claims are very relevant, especially when someone builds a permanent structure on private land without consent. This certified survey, backed by both county and state authorities, shows clearly that your office is sitting on Martinez property, land we've owned, uninterrupted, since 1887. Every day you operate there, you're committing criminal trespass. I handed copies of the survey to Karen, her attorney, and the residents who had come to watch. The reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the group as neighbors compared the official documents to Karen's bold claims. Her lawyer frantically flipped through the papers, clearly searching for some technicality that might save them. Most satisfying of all was Karen herself. She had gone pale, her bravado crumbling as reality set in. This is absurd. She finally snapped, her voice rising, her carefully cultivated image of authority giving way to raw indignation. Karen's voice rose with fury as she clutched the documents. You can't just wave some old survey around and declare ownership of community land. There are procedures, regulations, and proper channels. Real authorities have to review claims like this. But even as she barked out her protest, I could see the truth dawning on her. She knew the fight was slipping out of her hands. The neighbors she dragged along for support were no longer nodding in agreement. Instead, their expression shifted to doubt, even suspicion. Her so-called attorney was already inching backward, clearly planning his retreat. Remaining composed, I addressed her evenly. Miss Whitmore, you have 72 hours to remove your office structure from my property. If it's still here after that, I'll pursue criminal trespass charges and file a civil suit for damages. And I strongly advise you to consult a legitimate attorney about the federal crimes you've committed in setting up this fake HOA. Right then, Deputy Mike Torres pulled up, stepping out of his patrol car just in time to witness Karen unraveling in front of everyone. The timing couldn't have been better. The small crowd she'd assembled quickly dispersed, muttering to themselves, while Karen's bravado crumbled into desperate threats about oversight committees and regulatory authorities. But her tone betrayed her. She knew her empire was collapsing. Watching her drive away, I felt something I hadn't in months: satisfaction. For the first time, it seemed justice was starting to catch up with her. The battle was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted. I finally had the upper hand. Karen's answer to my 72-hour demand came fast and reckless. Instead of dismantling her illegal setup, she doubled down. By Thursday morning, she had hired a private security firm that looked less like neighborhood watchmen and more like the kind of enforcers you'd see outside a loan shark's office. These men weren't the clumsy amateurs from before. They carried themselves like professionals trained to intimidate. They positioned themselves around my land as if it were a courthouse under federal guard. But she didn't stop there. Karen also filed for an emergency injunction against me, painting me as a dangerous extremist. The petition was a masterpiece of fabrication, accusing me of terroristic threats, radical anti-community behavior, and even plotting to disrupt neighborhood development. Reading through it felt like watching someone dig a pit and jump in willingly. The lies were outrageous. but I couldn't help but marvel at her audacity to file such nonsense with a straight face. What she hadn't realized was that Mike Torres had been quietly investigating her entire operation, and what he uncovered made the situation far bigger than I'd ever imagined. He showed up at my cabin that afternoon, his face pale with anger, holding a thick folder of documents. "David, this isn't just Karen freelancing for her own gain. She's on Pinnacle Development's payroll, $15,000 a month, plus bonuses every time a property changes hands under her so-called management authority. She's not an host camera, she's a cog in a massive criminal machine." Mike laid out the evidence, and the scope floored me. Pinnacle wasn't just operating here, they had similar schemes running in more than 20 states. Their pattern was chilling: identify minority-owned land, install fake community coordinators, pressure families through harassment and intimidation, and then buy their properties for a fraction of their value. The company had seized over 400 properties this way, reaping close to $400 million. "And it gets worse," Mike said grimly. "I found recordings of Karen speaking directly with her Pinnacle contacts. She openly talks about targeting certain demographics, using intimidation tactics tailored to cultural vulnerabilities, and making sure unwanted families get the message that they don't belong." The recordings were damning. In one, Karen casually described Hispanic families as being more obedient to uniforms and official-looking paperwork, easy to control. In another, she explained the need for plausible deniability while ensuring so-called undesirable groups were pressured out of neighborhood by any means necessary. That was clearly Pinnacle's philosophy. The scale of the conspiracy was overwhelming, but it also meant we now had undeniable proof of crimes that stretched far beyond Karen's phony host stunt. The files and recordings Mike uncovered could support federal charges ranging from civil rights violations and wire fraud to conspiracy and racketeering under RICO. "Mike, this doesn't just put Karen in handcuffs," I told him. "This could topple Pinnacle's entire network and land some very powerful people in prison for decades." Almost on cue, my phone rang. It was Sarah Chen, who'd been coordinating with federal prosecutors on our civil rights complaint. Her voice carried the kind of energy that only comes with breakthrough news. "David, I think you are going to like these. The FBI's Civil Rights Division wants to meet with you tomorrow. They've been building a case against Pinnacle in several states, and your evidence fills in the gaps they've been missing. This could be the turning point." The following morning, I sat across from FBI agent Lisa Park. What she revealed made me realize how much bigger this operation was than I ever imagined. The Bureau had been chasing Pinnacle for years, tracing their schemes across state lines, but their airtight security had made it nearly impossible to infiltrate until Mike Torres delivered the documents and recordings straight from Karen's operation. "Mr. Martinez," Agent Park said, "your persistence gave us exactly what we needed to dismantle a criminal enterprise that's stolen from hundreds of families and pocketed hundreds of millions of dollars." Her investigation showed that Pinnacle wasn't just buying influence, they were running an entire shadow network. Corrupt county commissioners, building inspectors, even federal employees were in their pocket, feeding them insider information about zoning and environmental rules. Karen was just one cog in a machine made up of ex-officials, dirty cops, and developers who'd sold their integrity for bribes or blackmail. Taking them down would take a coordinated federal strike. Before I left, Agent Park asked me to go about my daily life while wearing a recording device. The idea was simple: Karen, under pressure, would lash out and make mistakes that would help seal the case against Pinnacle. Based on her profile, Agent Park explained, she'll grow more reckless the closer she gets to losing control. Desperation always leaves a trail. Driving home, I thought about how drastically my life had changed. A few weeks earlier, I was just a retired surveyor who wanted peace by the lake. Now I was playing a role in a federal investigation that could reshape property protections across the country. Karen Whitmore hadn't just targeted the wrong mod, she'd accidentally triggered a chain of events that would shine light on a nationwide conspiracy. Her scheme to steal my family's land was about to ensure that families everywhere kept theirs. Sometimes justice works in strange ways, and sometimes the quiet guy with old maps ends up being exactly the person needed to take down giants. But Karen wasn't finished yet. When she realized intimidation wasn't working and that federal heat was closing in, She escalated again, this time with psychological warfare. The next morning, the community woke up to flyers plastered across mailboxes and telephone poles. They carried my photo alongside bold warnings claiming I was under investigation for domestic terrorism. The documents were dressed up with fake FBI logos and phone numbers that redirected to her people, who posed as government hotlines. The tactic worked immediately. Neighbors who'd waved at me a week earlier now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Strangers snapped photos of my cabin and my truck. Even the grocery clerk asked point-blank if I was that terrorist guy. Karen had poisoned the well, weaponizing fear and patriotism to turn me into an outcast. But what she thought was clever manipulation turned into a massive mistake. The FBI had been monitoring her communications ever since our meeting, and those flyers crossed multiple federal lines, impersonating law enforcement, mail fraud, and witness intimidation. On top of that, her calls with Pinnacle headquarters about neutralizing the Martinez problem had been intercepted by surveillance teams. That afternoon, Mike Torres called me, his voice buzzing with disbelief. "David, you're not going to believe these. The FBI just raided Karen's office, her house, and 3 Pinnacle facilities. They've arrested her, 2 Pinnacle execs, and even a county inspector who's been pocketing bribes for years. They've been planning this for weeks, but her latest stunt gave them exactly what they needed to move." The raids pulled in mountains of evidence, over 10,000 documents detailing Pinnacle's blueprint for land theft across the country, demographic studies on vulnerable neighborhoods, profiles of families they thought would fold under pressure, financial ledgers showing payments to officials. The most damning files of all were recordings of Pinnacle's leadership openly discussing how to leverage cultural biases and ethnic intimidation to drive minority families off their land. That evening, Agent Park laid out what came next. "Mr. Martinez, Karen's arrest is just the tip of the iceberg. We now have evidence of a conspiracy involving more than 200 people across nearly half the country. Developers, politicians, contractors. This case is going to rock the system." Odds earmarked for redevelopment. But the biggest shock came when Mike spread out internal planning documents on my kitchen table. Pinnacle wasn't just trying to flip a few homes, they were plotting a complete transformation of Lake Serenity. The company's long-term strategy was to convert the entire lakefront into a luxury resort and golf complex. They already had preliminary deals in place with a major hotel chain and top-course designers. The only thing in their way was the Martinez, Santos, and Herrera families, holding the last parcels of land they needed. "Karen's entire job," Mike said flatly, "is to make sure you sell, by any means necessary. Can't just pull out some old PCA." The charges filed were sweeping: racketeering, conspiracy, wire and mail fraud, civil rights violations, and even extortion under the guise of official authority. But the real shock came when Agent Park unveiled the organizational chart pieced together from Pinnacle's seized records. Pinnacle wasn't merely a development firm. It was essentially a sprawling criminal syndicate with tentacles woven deep into local governments nationwide. They had strategically placed insiders in county offices, zoning departments, and even sheriff's departments, giving them the ability to fabricate legal documents, manipulate permits, and wield fraudulent authority whenever it suited their schemes. "David," Agent Park told me gravely, "your case has uncovered a level of organized corruption we haven't seen since the major crime syndicate takedowns of the 1970s. The community's response was immediate. Within hours of Karen's arrest, multiple families came forward with their own chilling accounts. The Santos family admitted they had been threatened with their teenage son's arrest if they refused to sell. The Rodriguez couple revealed that Karen had weaponized social services against them, filing false reports that they were being neglected by their own children. Each testimony painted a darker picture. Intimidation wasn't random, it was systematic, calculated to terrify vulnerable families into giving up their homes. But the most satisfying moment came when the county launched an emergency audit of all permits issued under Karen's watch. It turned out her own HOA headquarters had been constructed illegally, built on forged permits and rubber-stamped inspections. The verdict: condemnation. Demolition crews were scheduled to bring the building down within a week. Watching justice literally dismantle Karen's false empire was nothing short of poetic. The federal investigation also revealed just how ambitious Pinnacle's designs for Lake Serenity had been. Among the documents were glossy architectural blueprints and financial projections for a massive luxury resort. The plan would have wiped out every existing home and transformed the lake into a private retreat for the wealthy elite, funneling more than $600 million in profits to Pinnacle. For those of us who called Lake Serenity home, the message was clear: our fight had never just been about individual property lines. It was about saving an entire community from erasure. As the story spread through national media, I started receiving calls from families across the country. Their experiences echoed ours almost word for word: fake officials, harassment campaigns, and relentless pressure to sell land at a fraction of its value. The FBI quickly set up a victim hotline. Within just 2 days, more than 300 families had come forward. What started as a local fight in my quiet lakeside town had now exploded into a national civil rights case. Karen Whitmore's attempt to rob my family of its land had backfired spectacularly. In trying to intimidate us, she had accidentally pulled back the curtain on a sprawling criminal empire. It was proof that sometimes, the battles you never plan to fight become the ones that matter most, not just for yourself, but for countless others you may never even meet. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Chicago was overflowing with press, victims, and supporters as the Pinnacle racketeering trial began. Sitting in the witness section among families from a dozen different states, I realized just how vast this conspiracy had been. Over 400 families had been targeted, spanning nearly a decade of organized fraud and intimidation. When I took the stand as the government's primary witness, the weight of it all hit me. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had prepared me for this day, but standing before a jury and recounting how Karen's fake HOA had tried to steal my family's land still felt surreal. "Mr. Martinez," she began, "please explain to the court how you first discovered that the Lake Serenity HOA was not legitimate." I told them about the morning Karen appeared at my doorstep with her fraudulent authority and thinly veiled bigotry. As I spoke, I could see jurors shaking their heads in disbelief. The most powerful moment came when Walsh asked me to share the history of my family's land. My great-grandfather, Miguel Martinez, purchased that land in 1887 with the wages he earned helping build the railroad. He came to this country legally, with nothing but a dream to own property and create a better life for his children. When Karen Whitmore tried to steal that land using intimidation and fake government power, she wasn't just attacking my family. She was striking at the very principle that every American, no matter their name or accent, has the right to own and keep their property. The defense scrambled to portray Karen and Pinnacle's leaders as misunderstood business professionals, claiming any discrimination was accidental. But the evidence was overwhelming. Recordings of Karen targeting families based on ethnicity, and Pinnacle documents referring to minority landowners as acquisition opportunities rather than human beings. Mike Torres's testimony sealed their fate. Granted immunity, he admitted how Karen had manipulated him, twisting his good intentions into complicity. "She made me believe I was protecting my neighbors," he confessed, voice cracking. "But what she really wanted was for me to help her terrorize Hispanic families so Pinnacle could steal their land." The prosecution then unveiled Pinnacle's broader conspiracy. Financial investigators traced hundreds of millions in illicit profits, while Agent Lisa Park detailed how the company had built an entire shadow infrastructure of fake authority and corrupted officials. But the biggest revelation came when prosecutors showed that Pinnacle hadn't acted alone. Their entire operation had been bolstered by corruption at the federal level. Specifically, inside the Department of Housing and Urban, a broken bar to HUD insiders had been secretly feeding Pinnacle advanced details about upcoming housing programs and environmental policies. With that knowledge, the company was able to swoop in and seize land in areas that were about to skyrocket in value thanks to federal investment. "This isn't just corporate greed," Prosecutor Walsh told the jury. "This is a coordinated conspiracy that reached into the very agencies designed to protect American homeowners." The turning point of the trial came when Pinnacle CEO, Jonathan Pierce, testified in his own defense. What followed was a complete dismantling of his credibility. Walsh walked him step by step through company records showing Pierce had personally signed off on targeting specific demographics, approving the very strategies that stripped minority families of their homes, When Pierce attempted to feign ignorance, Walsh produced recordings from executive meetings where Pierce himself spoke of clearing out undesirable populations from future development zones. The jury needed less than 6 hours to convict Pierce, Karen, and the other defendants on every count. The sentences were harsh, reflecting the sheer scale of damage done. Karen was handed 8 years in federal prison for fraud, racketeering, and civil rights violations. Pierce received 15 years along with a $290 million restitution order to compensate the victims. But perhaps the most powerful result of the trial was the precedent it created. Judge Patricia Kim's ruling established what legal experts immediately began calling the Martinez Doctrine, a federal standard making corporate-sponsored fake HOAs a crime on their own, with increased penalties for schemes targeting minority communities. The defendants carried out a deliberate campaign to strip citizens of their constitutional rights based on race and ethnicity, Judge Kim said during sentencing. This court will ensure the punishment reflects the gravity of those crimes. For me, watching Karen led away in cuffs was satisfying, but the deeper victory was knowing our case would shield countless families from suffering the same fate. 6 months later, the Martinez Property Protection Act became law, providing nationwide protections against fraudulent HOA operations. Standing in the Rose Garden as the president signed the bill named after my family was surreal. I thought back to that first morning when I refused to sign Karen's Sham Lake Association paperwork and never imagining it would lead here. 3 years after the trial that crushed Pinnacle, I stood again at the dock where it all began, the sunrise reflecting across what was now officially named Martinez Lake. The county had renamed it to honor both my family's century-long connection to the land and the role our fight played in defending property rights nationwide. The sign at the entrance had become a kind of landmark, drawing civil rights advocates and families who found inspiration in our story. The changes in our community since Karen's downfall were remarkable. The Santos family used their restitution to grow their farm into a flourishing business that supplied restaurants across the region. The Rodriguezes were finally able to afford critical medical care, and their grandchildren visited every summer to fish the same waters their grandfather once taught me to love. Even more importantly, we founded the Lake Serenity Property Rights Foundation, an organization dedicated to defending families against fake HOAs and corrupt developers. What started as my personal struggle evolved into a national mission. The federal law created after our case eventually led to the establishment of an entire office dedicated to rooting out fraudulent property schemes, and I now served as an advisor training agents to spot them early. Every month, I was invited to speak at conferences, congressional hearings, and community events about protecting families from predatory land grabs. But the most rewarding work was directly helping families like Mania through the support network that had grown from our hotline. Just last year, we dismantled operations in 7 states and secured more than $50 million in restitution. One of the most powerful cases involved a Native American community in Montana. A company calling itself Tribal Land Management Services was using forged federal documents to trick families into abandoning their ancestral lands. Their tactics were identical to what Karen had attempted: fake authority, fear, and cultural manipulation. Working alongside tribal leaders and federal agents, we shut them down before any families lost their homes, and the perpetrators received long prison terms. Perhaps the most surprising chapter came when Karen herself appeared at my door after serving 6 years of her sentence. She was not the same woman who had once tried to strip my family of everything we owned. Prison had humbled her. She told me she was working with legal aid groups now, helping victims of property scams. "I can't undo what I did," she admitted, her voice steady but soft, "but I can use what I know to stop people like me from hurting others." I didn't forgive her, and I told her so, but I acknowledged that her efforts mattered and that change, however incomplete, was better than continuing the cycle of harm. The ripple effects of our case continued to spread. Law schools taught the Martinez Doctrine, Civil rights lawyers cited our case in their arguments. Congress had even strengthened the legislation twice since its passage. What began as a fight for one family's land had grown into a movement that reshaped property law nationwide. As I prepared to take another call, this time from a family in Texas whose elderly grandmother was being pressured to sell her farm under the guise of eminent domain, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. Karen's attempt to erase my family's history had, in the end, safeguarded the rights of thousands of others. Justice works in mysterious ways. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't punishment, it's making sure the harm that touched your life can never harm anyone else again. Has your HOA ever crossed the line or unfairly targeted your family? You're not alone. Like my story shows, ordinary people can fight back against corruption with knowledge and persistence. Your property rights matter, and your voice deserves to be heard. If this story inspired you, please support Just Stories by liking and subscribing for more true accounts of justice, courage, and the power of knowing your rights. Together, we can defend our communities.